On this episode of Boundary Breakers, I sit down with Dr. Chris Frueh for part 2 of our discussion on operator syndrome. Dr. Frueh is the world's leading expert on operator syndrome, which is what many of our military veterans are currently living with every day as the heavy cost fighting for their country in the global war on terror. It's a really interesting discussion and something that I'm very passionate about. So I think you guys are really going to enjoy this episode. Boundary Breakers is brought to you by Carter & Clark. Fantastic. Well, so if you recall, the title of the podcast is Boundary Breakers. And we've interviewed several folks from the SOF community. We've had SEALs on. We've had Delta Force operators on. And whether it's military or athlete, or in business, we highlight stories of those that have done extraordinary things. And there's just by definition, our special operations veterans have done extraordinary things. Sometimes there are consequences or results that occur based on doing those extraordinary things. And having you on is the perfect opportunity to shine the light on exactly that.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really important. Can you help just make sure that the audience understands when we talk about the special operations community or special operators or operators, what makes the special operations community or operators unique?
Yeah. Well, that's a great place to start because I think there's a lot of misconceptions. People have watched the movies. Maybe they've read a book or two, they've seen the TV shows, but most people really don't understand what it means to be a special operator. I think people understand it's something elite and it's something that involves danger. I think what most people don't appreciate is the extent of the physiological, call it allostatic load. It's a hypothetical term for all of the things that kind of load onto somebody over the course of time, and it's cumulative. So what makes the SOF community unique? And there's many things. Let's start with blast exposures. Operators across all of the branches do quite a bit of training with breaching, demolitions, shoulder-fired rockets, heavy machine guns, sniper rifles, and even just handguns and assault rifles. All of those involve, some degree, in the case of a handgun, it's a small blast. In the case of breaching and demolitions, it's a gigantic blast. And so simply from training alone over the course of several years, operators are going to receive an enormous amount of blast exposure. And that leads to traumatic brain injury. There's no way around it. It's just inevitable. So 95% of operators have a TBI by the time they are essentially trained and ready for deployment. It's just the nature of the work. So blast exposures, and then plus we also have impact exposures and whiplash. We have impact forces, we have whiplash, so we have a lot of other things that also affect and injure the brain. An impact force causes a bruise, which we call concussion to the brain. And if we go way downstream at the end of a career with a lot of impact forces, we might find something on a postmortem study known as, that sometimes has been labeled chronic traumatic encephalopathy. And that is identified only at postmortem by a buildup of tau proteins, TAU proteins in the brain. Blast exposures cause an entirely different signature injury. Blasts have a shearing effect. They go through the soft tissue of the body. And yeah, they probably rattle and bruise the brain along the way, but they're actually those exposures go through the brain and they cause a different signature injury that we can find in postmortem studies. And that's a scarring pattern in the glial cells. So the glial cells are the support cells, the support network for the neurons. They hold neurons in place, they protect them, they insulate them, and they carry out the toxins. So those get injured, those get scarred from blasts. So that's right there are two things that are wildly. I think they're the causes. They're two of the primary causes of the types of complex injuries that we see in operators. And I think it's important to say that they're not the only ones. Artillery, civil combat engineers, Marines and other units engaging in a lot of demolitions, urban combat. So it isn't just operators, but what makes operators different is the extent of the training and the length of their career. So if you have an operator most operators serve 10, 15, many serve 20 or more years. It's not a 4-year enlistment period, almost ever. So not only is it a magnitude of difference more than conventional soldiers, it's also a much longer period of time that they're enduring these exposures. So I usually start with that. Now, there's some other very clear differences. High operational tempo, the high op tempo, the chronic stress and elevated stress hormones that go with that. Deployments are fast and furious. Many units, if they are deployed, are going, to a war zone or some other, hot area, are going out every night. They're not going out once a week. They're not having occasional missions. They're not doing, anything that we would consider to be simple and safe. They're going out and kicking doors every night, frequently. And that's on deployment. When they're home, they go through these very intensive training evolutions, many of which are not at home. So a SEAL who lives in Virginia Beach may come home to his family, but then for a week, and then may go off and be at a training site for a month or 3 months. That's potentially far away. And the training itself is very dangerous, very stressful. Many operators get injured severely in training, and there are deaths in training. They train like they fight. So whatever they're going to need to do in a deployment, they're going to train for extensively. We are talking about a lot of disruption to sleep. So sleep deprivation, circadian disruption, traveling across time zones, working at night. Even when they're in the US, even when they're home, they often train at night because that's when missions are. So you get a lot of circadian disruption that has a lasting effect. And we'll come back and we can talk about that. Certainly there are many toxic exposures, radiologicals, biologicals, all the vaccines that they get, all of the stuff that's in their equipment and their gear and in their uniforms, the quality of the air and the water that they're exposed to when they're overseas, and then the physicality of what they do, the rucking with heavy weight on their back, the diving, the diving training, the jumping out of airplanes, parachuting, rappelling, fast roping out of a helicopter, the combatives, the physical combative training that they do with each other, which involves frequently loss of oxygen as therapy if somebody's being choked out. That's one of the questions I always ask people is how many times have you been choked out? And it's not uncommon for somebody to say 5, 6, 7 times. And then we have driving. The tactical driving is another physicality that most people don't think about. Operators get trained in tactical driving, meaning, they bring in NASCAR drivers to teach them how to go real fast. And if in a war zone, and this isn't just operators, this is something that a lot of private defense contractors and soldiers also experience. Going up and down Route Irish, for example, in Iraq, you're going fast, 100 plus miles an hour. You're not stopping for obstacles. You're veering around things. You're going over and through whatever's in your way. That involves a lot of bumping around, a lot of whiplash. So there's just a lot of physicality to everything that operators do.
Yeah.
We have a lot of psychological issues. And again, the tip of the spear, operators are the tip of the spear, and they have longer careers. So over the course of a career, our operators are involved in a lot of death, a lot of violence, loss of teammates, witnessing horrific deaths of others, including civilians in, in places where they're deployed. Probably the toughest kind of thing for any soldier to see is the death of a child, or innocent, families that have been targeted by insurgents or just happen to be in the wrong, happen to be very unlucky in the wrong place at the wrong time. We see enormous number of orthopedic injuries. So very common for guys to report 5, 6, 8 surgeries, orthopedic surgeries during the course of a career, some with many more. And it isn't just the surgeries, but it's also all that physicality that leaves a lasting, repetitive injury on the joints in the body. And part of that is the training, the intensive weightlifting and running and all the physical fitness kinds of things that they do. I did the Murph challenge a few years ago, where you put on body armor. I used a weight vest, and you run a mile, you do 100 pull-ups, you do 200 push-ups, 300 squats, and then you run another mile with the weight on you. And afterwards, my elbows did not want to function. They were very angry with me. They didn't want to function for about a week. Now, I did that one time. Other guys do something like that a couple times a week or more. And oftentimes it's even more intense than I just described. So there's just an enormous wear and tear on the physical body over time. I would add a couple other things in there that are really unique, and that's the time away from home. They're very rarely home. I've heard guys estimate that over the course of a couple of decades, they were home 60% of the time. 40% of the time, 25% of the time. So they're missing anniversaries, holidays, milestones. They're missing their kids', first band concert, their soccer games, their parties with friends. And then let's just add one more thing on top of all of that is kind of the concept of being a never quit culture. And that's inherent in who operators are. That's the only way a soldier gets through the assessment and selection to become an operator, is to be willing to push through pain, willing to keep going when everything is hurting and nothing feels like it's working. And that never quit culture means guys do things like they don't raise their hand and ask for help. Guys will go on a deployment with a broken ankle. They just don't want to say anything. They will go on deployments with all kinds of injuries rather than ask, because they don't want to miss a deployment. They don't want to let their teammates down. You go until you literally can't go any longer. And part of that is, a lot of that is mental, but that is mental. It takes a toll on the physical body. Guys also will do things like, you're supposed to wait. When you plan a charge, a breaching charge, for example, you're supposed to wait a certain period you're supposed to count to 3, and you're supposed to be a certain distance back. Well, guys cheat on that. It's part of the never quit culture. The last guy through the door, might get a funny look from his teammates. So everybody's running before they should be running towards that door, towards that opening, towards that charge. And so in so many ways, guys injure themselves, but they just keep going and going and going and going. And that has the effect over time of really allowing those injuries to accumulate over time. And so that cumulative allostatic load that's inherent in this profession, in this role, this profession, is just massive.
Yeah. I mean, it's unbelievable to even really hear when you stack everything up like you just did. objectively, here's everything that these guys are subjected to, it's pretty incredible to hear. Something struck me while you were explaining the brain injury, when you were describing the different brain injuries, the concussive type with the CTE versus the blast type with the scarring, right? I immediately started thinking about all of the stuff in the NFL with NFL players, right? Whether it be NFL and boxers or the sport of boxing.
Yes.
And so I think to relate this, or to sort of explain this to the maybe the general public or the audience that might not be as familiar with special operations, if you think about things like CTE and what a big deal that has been in the NFL, and how what a major medical issue that is, and then realize that NFL players don't have the circadian disruption, they don't have to do the professional driving, they don't have to any of this, the psychological issues, right? They're not seeing death and children's death, right? They don't have the time away from home. It's a totally different culture where if they feel something tweak, right, they might call timeout and go get treatment and make sure their body stays healthy, as opposed to the never quit culture that you described. But to me, that just was really helpful in sort of painting the picture of how severe as you put it, the allostatic load is on this community, when you sort of compare and contrast it to something that we've heard in the news, like with the CTE or something. I just think that just gives us a really good understanding of the level.
Operators are tactical athletes. They really are. And the difference is their careers tend to go much longer than most professional athletes. And they're not making millions of dollars. And nobody knows who they are for the most part. They're not getting accolades along the way. But in terms of what they do, it's not Sunday afternoon at the ballpark. It's a no-fail mission. It's life and death mission. People are dying. People are going to die. Now that said, I think most athletes do play through injuries. I think if you looked at NFL players, probably on any given Sunday, 80 to 90% have some kind of serious, significant injury that they're playing with. So that's not that piece of it is probably there. But yeah, there's a lot of similarities, but also I would say the life of an operator is far more extreme. Now there's other people. Let's talk about first responders here for a moment. Certainly tactical first responders, SWAT teams, FBI hostage rescue, DEA, tactical response teams, all of those guys have very similar, training and career activities, with the difference that they're doing their work at home. They're not kicking doors, on the other side of the globe. They're living at home and going out for their shift and doing their work. Firefighters, they're going into structure fires. They're dealing with unknown elements and potential chemicals in the air when they go into a structure fire. And of course, they see death and violence. They see children dying. So firefighters and law enforcement have their own version of much of this. They don't have the blast exposures. They don't have the circadian disruption typically, although they might be working at night, so maybe they do. But I like to include first responders in the discussion because they have a lot of similar kinds of injuries, and they have even less available to them in terms of treatment and societal awareness than soldiers do typically.
Yeah. Well, so is it fair to say that one of the things that make the special operations community unique, in addition, and I think that's great and important to include first responders. But what makes that community so unique is, in the scientific terms, is the high allostatic load. But in the lay terms, is it just sort of that they do everything, all of this stuff that they experience, they experience a more extreme level or extreme exposure for a longer period of time, typically, than a traditional, infantry soldier. Is that fair?
Yeah, by an order of magnitude.
Okay.
Yeah. Both
And
in the
so,
short term and the long term because of the length of the careers. Here's an example. A friend of mine was telling me that a former Navy SEAL, that his platoon did some kind of training evolution at some specific base, Army base or military base. I don't remember where it was, where they shot, I think, over the course of months, they shot hundreds of thousands of rounds of rifle ammunition. And to them, that was just kind of normal. What they were told at some point along the way was they had shot more as a platoon than several battalions of infantry soldiers had in the same period of time. And they, not only was it a more intense, on a per man basis, but they also pointed out that the battalions that were shooting only did that kind of training like on a rare occasion. It wasn't a normal training evolution for them. So the SEAL platoon that had done this was just a normal, regular workup, part of a training evolution for them.
Wow, that's a great example, and also it's just incredible to think about and hard for us to wrap our minds around.
It really is.
Like when we say elite, you hear some of these elite 0.001%, tip of the spear. A lot of those things have been, I think, watered down, but to really try and think about what does that mean? What does that mean? Whether it's just a workup or a training thing, it's just amazing the level that they push these guys to become warfighting machines. Just incredible. So you started, and I don't want to put any words in your mouth at all. So this is like, don't correct me, but please correct me, and don't let me misconstrue it. But you started to identify certain commonalities amongst the special operations community with regard to, after they came home or post-retirement, with regard to different effects, right, that they were having from this stuff. Could you just sort of walk us through like how that kind of came about, and then the term that you have helped come up with to describe it?
Well, I think what we do see is a very common pattern of injuries, severe injuries and impairments that are all interrelated, which is part of what makes them complex. It's not just that they're serious, it's also that they connect all of the physiological systems in the human body are affected together simultaneously. So when we think about operator health, we have to think of the nervous system. We have to think of the endocrine system, the cardiovascular system, the musculoskeletal system, the digestive system, etc., the metabolic system. All of our perceptual systems, they all get affected. And so we've called this operator syndrome, this pattern of common injuries. It is something that is essentially inevitable for an operator, and it gets worse over the longer the career. It can get worse. These injuries can get worse, and we'll come back and just talk about them. But conceptually, the operator, starting at the beginning, early part of a career, as a young, healthy, powerful man, usually a man. There are some females. And then as they go through their career, by the time they're 30, 35, 40, they are experiencing a buildup of these injuries and these impairments. And a lot of guys really kind of wait until first of all, it's not well understood. A lot of guys don't know what's happening to them. A lot of care providers don't fully appreciate what's, the nature of these injuries. And so oftentimes it's not addressed until the end of a career or after a career. But I can go through these injuries very quickly. How about if I do that, and then we can kind of go into them a little bit more. So traumatic brain injury is probably the signature injury. Sleep sleep disturbance that has a long-lasting is a long-lasting problem for a lot of guys, including sleep apnea. We think of sleep apnea as being something that affects, older men who are overweight. It's common, very common in, soldiers who are 30 or more. One of my guys who's currently a DevGru just got diagnosed. He's in his early 30s. Just got diagnosed with sleep apnea, and he has a CPAP machine now that that's been prescribed to him, and he'll use that for the rest of his life, hopefully.
He's currently with Deborah?
He's active at DevGru. So traumatic brain injury, sleep problems, hormone problems. We see short-term drops in testosterone in guys coming back from a deployment. Significant, not just a little dip, but dropping all the way down. In younger operators, it often comes back up if they have a chance to kind of pause and rest and reset after coming home from a deployment. But over time, over the course of the career, by 35, by 40, most operators are chronically low testosterone, as well as dysregulation in other hormones. And by the time they're retired and in their 40s, usually that low T is a significant problem, and it's pervasive and chronic. So we're trying to move the needle on getting the DoD and the VA to pay more attention to hormonal dysregulation and to be more available to treat low testosterone, which, by the way, does not mean testosterone replacement therapy all the time. In fact, probably not most of the time. There are other treatments that we can use. There are other medications that can be taken for a short term that will help re-regulate the hormones. We also know just simply sleep and rest and healthy diet are also very good for helping hormones recover themselves. We see a lot of psychological issues that are really kind of in the depression, anxiety, anger space. PTSD is part of it, but PTSD is not the core problem. It's probably not even the most common psychological problem. Operators don't show the fear reactivity that we think of that really is the core feature of PTSD. They may have bad dreams and nightmares. They may have heightened arousal in terms of being vigilant to their surroundings, even when they're at home. But they don't have the fear reactivity of PTSD. So I don't really think of PTSD as a significant core injury for operators. Substance abuse is a problem. A lot of operators drink heavily. It's part of the culture. It's part of the norms, social norms of teams and units. It's also a terrific way to kind of numb oneself up. And I don't mean terrific as in a good way, but it does have that effect of numbing oneself. A lot of guys will say they can't sleep without alcohol. And of course, you're not really sleeping. You're kind of passing out for a few hours. But alcohol is a depressant. It interferes with sleep. It interferes with mood. It certainly interferes with cognitive functioning and brain health. Perceptual impairments in many of the systems. So hearing is often impaired, including ringing in the ears, tinnitus. Vision is often impaired. I mean, the head has been jarring around so much, and those blast exposures do go through the tiny, delicate little muscles of the eye. And so a lot of operators develop a variety of vision problems, including blurry vision. And then balance. With a TBI, it's very common to have disequilibrium problems, sometimes going as far as vertigo, where guys are dizzy and also nauseous at the same time. That's certainly not an uncommon experience. On top of that, we have the chronic pain in the body. We have headaches. We have cognitive impairments to concentration, to memory. It's actually very hard to learn new things with a TBI. So a lot of operators kind of keep going on muscle memory, things that they've already learned. But when they come to the transition point, learning a new skill, learning a new trade, a new career path can be very difficult for a lot of guys if they haven't had the treatment that they need. And then all the profound effects on family relationships, marital relationships, emotional intimacy, sexual intimacy, can be very profound. And we know there's a very high divorce rate. We know that many children of operators really have pretty heavy childhoods. One teenager of a good friend of mine, his father was a SEAL, Navy SEAL, described to me, and I think this is common, so that's kind of giving this as an example, described to me that throughout his childhood, he would have these intrusive thoughts that would come to him, wondering, was his father alive? Sitting in class with the thought, it's possible. My dad could have just been killed an hour ago and I don't know it yet. I just haven't been informed. He also described going to over a dozen funerals of men that he considered to be uncles. These were his father's teammates, killed in action, killed in training accidents, training incidents. You have the transitions. Transition coming home from a deployment, transition leaving the military after a lengthy career. For first responders, you have the transition of coming home at the end of every shift, where maybe you've seen something, been a part of something horrible, and then you come home and it's just like any other day. You come home, you take your uniform off, and you sit down with your family, and you try to pretend that nothing happened that day. The last thing that I guess I would, and we can spend some time on this if you like, I said that I don't think of PTSD as being a signature injury here, but what is essentially universal are some set of existential concerns that vary quite a bit by individual, but everybody has some existential experiences, which we might call, we can go through some of the common ones, but sometimes these are referred to as moral injury. Survivor's guilt would be an example. Loss, grief are examples. The horror of killing as well as the joy of killing. We don't really associate killing with happiness or joy or exhilaration, but it's not uncommon for operators to become not only habituated to killing, habituated to violence, but to reach a point where it's thrilling, it's exciting, it's exhilarating. I've had guys describe to me what it felt like to survive and triumph in a hand-to-hand close encounter fight where the enemy was killed and the operator was able to walk away. And they describe that feeling of exhilaration, of triumph, even though they may have blood and the other enemy's, body parts all over them. And some guys will talk about missing it. They miss it. And then they miss it and feel guilty about missing it. So it becomes really complicated. How does a man tell his children, his spouse, his family that he enjoyed the killing? They can't say that. So they don't talk about it. And they have a secret shame within them for even having those thoughts. We're not supposed to miss killing. So then we miss it, but at the same time, we also feel ashamed that we might miss it. All of that also can lead to a loss of empathy. A lot of guys describe, the empathy threshold is reset. That benchmark of when a man becomes concerned about others becomes a little different. How do the day-to-day stressors that you and I and everybody in civilian society, how do those day-to-day stressors align up with some of the things that operators and soldiers have seen and done and been a part of? So to other people, they often just seem to be insensitive, mean, grumpy, non-empathic. And that's a real whammy on family relationships and connections with other people.
Yeah, I'm sure. A couple of things that I want to circle back on. The transition, I don't think I've given that the appropriate thought or really considered that until hearing you talk about some of the emotions involved with killing. I can't imagine what it would be like to live an environment where killing is the goal and is something that is frequent, and then having to come back into regular everyday society where killing will put you're in prison for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
That has to be a very difficult thing to navigate.
It certainly sets them apart from everybody else, those experiences. And, a part of it, I think, is when we talk about transitioning out of a career in the military, what a soldier is losing at that point is they're losing their mission and purpose, because what do they do now? They're losing their identity. Who are they now? And they're losing their tribe. They're no longer surrounded by the men and women who they've deployed with, trained with, lived with, whose lives they've supported and who have supported their life. And so it's all of this, and then you're stepping out into this whole new culture and society where you don't understand civilians. Civilians don't understand you. Most Americans have very little understanding of the global war on terror. We don't know the history. We don't know the politics. We don't know what happened. We don't even know what's happening now today. We have troops in contact, guarantee it, all over the world in places that people don't even think about. And so they come back to a world that tells them, well, welcome home. Thank you for your service. And now you're a civilian. So get on with your life and just live like the rest of us.
Yeah. That's the part that it just makes me irate. And we were talking earlier, I think off camera, about the least that we can do is try to understand this and get them the support that they need for what they have done and what they continue to have to experience. I mean, the absolute least that we can do is try to figure this out, understand it, and get them the help that they need. And one thing that you mentioned that I think is worth maybe spending a little bit more time on, you mentioned that the sort of the fear response with PTSD, or just that PTSD in general is not an overwhelming factor in operator syndrome. I get the feeling that most people, if they were to hear about this casually or think about this, they sort of just lump this in as, oh yeah, soldiers have PTSD.
Yes.
So
you just hit the nail on the head there, Brandon. We have turned PTSD into the easy button. Soldier, first responder goes in to see any healthcare provider in Western medicine, and they're almost certainly going to be immediately diagnosed or labeled with PTSD, which is I think PTSD itself has kind of become not just the easy button, but it's become a way of kind of letting ourselves off the hook. We go, oh, you did these horrible things. I can't imagine what that must mean, but boom, you have PTSD. And now we've done our job. We've figured out your problem, and we've told you what your problem is. And now we're going to treat your problem with two ingredients: psychotherapy and psychiatric medications. And both of those can be very appropriate, and they can be very, very important, very, very necessary components of treatment. Unfortunately, that's, first of all, usually that's as far as the treatment goes. So once the PTSD diagnosis has been made, almost never does the care providers follow up with a hormone panel, a sleep study, consult to a pain doctor. So that's one concern. A second concern is As much as I am a fan of psychotherapy, I don't know there aren't very many therapists of any stripe out there who understand soldiers, who understand first responders, who understand especially the extreme nature of special operations. So they're not culturally competent. Now, humble, curious therapists can quickly be educated by their patients if they are open to learning. But many are not open to learning. Many come into this with the assumption of it's PTSD, and here's how we treat PTSD, and all PTSD is the same, without really appreciating even the culture or the context within which things occur. The problem with psychiatry and psychiatric medications is too often patients end up with way too many medications. I mean, I am not exaggerating when I say this. I know of many veterans who have kind of maxed out at 20, 22 different medications, most of which are related to psychiatric symptoms. And they get better when they bring that down to 0 or down to 1 or 2. And so part of my, intense frustration with my own field, but all of medicine, is we've overused PTSD as the easy button. We've failed to follow up and do other assessments that are needed. And we treat with over-medication and very poor quality psychotherapy. And we do all of that while ignoring all these other treatments that might be useful and beneficial, such as psychedelic medicines, such as stellate ganglion blocks, ketamine infusions, vestibular therapy, speech pathology therapy, transcranial magnetic stimulation therapies, all the functional medicine treatments that involve, dietary supplements and carefully matching a patient's metabolic functioning and blood deficiencies in various micronutrients and vitamins with what they need. We're not using stem cells and exomes and peptides to the extent that we can and should be. So we have so many treatments to offer that are just not being provided. And guys and gals that need them oftentimes don't even know about them. And if they do know about them, they can't get them. They can't find them. They're either not available in the VA, or they're private insurers, or they're just told, no, you don't get that. We don't want to do that for you.
So this has also got to be extraordinarily frustrating for the operators, right?
Hugely so. Hugely so.
You mentioned sort of the easy button. Oh, this is PTSD. Here's medication, and then here's psychiatric therapy. But if I'm an operator, not that I know what that feels like, but I can imagine that they would sit down in front of just a typical psychiatrist or a therapist and ask themselves, what you've never seen you have not seen what I've seen. You have not been asked you haven't done any of this stuff. What could you possibly tell me about how to fix me when you haven't done it? And then thinking or the suggestion that, a couple of medications, psychiatric medications, and everything will be fine, seems to me, and this is ignorance speaking, right? So please don't, but it seems to me like that's not a whole lot different than the alcohol treatment, if you will, that we were discussing earlier, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you give somebody 20 medications or more, and maybe it might hopefully numb it like alcohol will. But
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
can you talk to us about what our operators are facing when they're clearly, I mean, almost in hell? You line all of these symptoms up. It's not a very fun existence.
No,
Yeah. So
the suffering and the impairments are extreme. Yeah.
And so when the frustrations, though, like what do they typically, what's the typical experience of an operator that's experiencing these symptoms and they go to the VA?
Typically, they're immediately told they have PTSD. They're immediately put on medications. They're immediately assigned to a therapist. At that point, a lot of operators never go back to the VA. It's kind of one and done in many cases. What's shocked me is how many operators go to the VA and have asked to have hormone checks, who have suggested they believe they have traumatic brain injury, and the hormone checks are denied, and they're told they don't have a traumatic brain injury. There's not a good understanding of blast exposures, so that's part of the problem is clinicians don't even know. But another part of the problem is because they're such high functioning individuals, they're not being compared to their baseline. So somebody who started with an IQ at the 85th percentile, which is pretty much where operators are. I mean, they're wicked smart, creative, outside the box thinkers. If they go to see, a clinician at a VA or anywhere, and they do some testing, and they test out at, say, the 60th percentile of IQ, they're told they're fine. They're told you're good. If they were never blown up in an IED, that also is often a marker to say, oh, you don't have a TBI, you were never injured. It's like, well, every day of the career was constant allostatic load on the brain. I have seen operators who tested out at, like, say, the 60th percentile on a test, be told they're normal, then they get the treatment they need, and they get retested, and they're back up at the 85th percentile. So that cognitive functioning really can return. It can be recovered, but only with the right treatments and the right approaches. I think the problem we see with psychotherapy, and this is essentially a story I've heard dozens of times. Operators will tell you that they will go to see a therapist, and it's a one and done. They go once and they say that therapist doesn't have a clue, and they don't come back. Sometimes that therapist becomes so upset when they hear what their experiences were. I've patients, many patients, operator patients will leave a therapy session because the therapist is too distressed. The therapist is so distraught over hearing some of their experiences that just kind of closes the door.
Wow.
Yeah. There's a deep distrust of psychiatry and psychology. Now, part of that, I think, is due to the fact that in the military, the psychiatrists and psychologists are part of the command structure. So if a soldier reports something to a therapist, that therapist has a dual role. Yeah, they're there to help the soldier, but they're also there and required to make any kind of fitness for duty report up the chain of command. So they have the power to essentially have a guy taken off the line, be pulled out of whatever he's doing. Guys don't want to miss a deployment. They don't want to miss a training evolution. They don't want to be identified as being weak, in their minds weak. Right. So psychologists and psychiatrists, I think in the military at least, have a challenge. I mean, it's a legitimate challenge. That's not their fault. It's the way we've set things up, right, as a system.
Well, so I want to dig more into how we can address this, or what, the things that you have done, what areas where we think we can improve. But I do also want to say, I mean, to the extent that there is an operator, there's an individual experiencing these things, or thinks that they might be, or they're struggling, or they're suffering, and they see this podcast or see you elsewhere, what can that individual do to get help?
Yeah.
If they've been sort of stiff-armed or not had a great experience with the traditional methods.
Yeah. I like that term, stiff-armed by the care providers. I like that phrase. I may use that myself. And I'll give you attribution.
No, please take it.
Well, so there's a number of things. One is get educated, learn for yourself. The operator syndrome paper is published in a peer-reviewed medical journal. If you do any kind of Google search, it will come right up. Yep, you can download it as a PDF. It's easy to find. It's free. It's easy to do that. What I often say to guys and spouses is go through this with a highlighter. Highlight your things that are concerns to you. Then you can take that to your doctor to any of your doctors and give it to them, educate them a little bit, and go in with a plan for what you want to ask for. Right off the bat, if you haven't had them, I would get a hormone blood panel done, and I would get a sleep study. Those are two very easy, low-hanging fruit that will give you a lot of information easily about things. From there, then you're going to want to consider what other kind of treatments do you need. And there are some good resources to learn about treatments. I've written a book titled Operator Syndrome. You can find that on Amazon. That's simply the title, Operator Syndrome. And in the book, half the book is on treatments, some of the novel things that are out there that you can find. There's some sample treatment plans, even so it's intended to be just a really simple, practical guide for operators and their spouses. It's written for the community. It's not written for psychologists and psychiatrists and neurologists. So that's another resource. But you're going to have to, if you can't find your way to one of the some foundations will provide good treatment. For SEALs, Navy SEALs can call the SEAL Future Foundation, and they have a very robust health program. They will talk with individuals. They will make the referrals. We've got a wide referral network, and then they pay for it. But most people aren't SEALs, so they don't have access to the SEAL Future Foundation. They can go to the SEAL Future Foundation website. We've, over the last couple of years, we have a medical advisory board, and the SEALs who actually run the health program together have cooperated, and those SEALs wrote up developed an extensive website that's essentially an encyclopedia of all the things you might want to know about to help treat operator syndrome. And that's public access. Any responder, any operator, any soldier, any combatant can use that. We are talking with elements of Israeli Defense Forces, and we're sharing that with them, and they're looking at it, and we're talking about how to help them set some of that up. There are other foundations out there. There's a handful of just terrific foundations that exist to help operators. So the Warrior Care Coalition, SOCF, Task Force Dagger, there's many of them. Warrior Health Foundation, America's Mighty Warriors, Talon's Reach. There's just so many of them. I don't know what the Green Beret Foundation does, but I think the Pararescue Foundation, the EOD Warrior Foundation, there are resources out there, but you got to go look for them and find them. If you're going to go to a VA, I know guys that have been fairly successful at going into the VA and persuading their VA providers to send them outside the VA to get a stellate ganglion block, to get a ketamine infusion. Let me talk about stellate ganglion block, if I may, just a little bit more. That's a treatment I would put up at the top of the list. So a sleep study, a hormone panel, and a stellate ganglion block. Stellate ganglion block is not a new treatment. It's been around since the 1920s.
Dr. Frueh, can you spell it just because
Sure,
I'm not exactly saying?
Sure. Stellate is STELLATE. Stellate. And the second word is ganglion. 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 The stellate ganglion is part of the sympathetic nervous system. So it runs down the central nervous system. It runs down the spinal column. Neurologists can access it at the side of the neck around C6, C7. And so what the treatment involves is doing just a very simple injection of medicine into that nerve system. And it's a very simple outpatient procedure, very low risk. I'm not aware of any long-term risks. It's not like you're getting an injection of a drug that's going to dope you up for some period of time. What it actually does is it reduces the physiological response, the fight or flight response of the sympathetic nervous system. So it produces virtually immediately, like within a few hours. It takes the baseline physiological arousal that a lot of operators are functioning at that might be at a 8 or a 9, and it just drops it down to a 2 or a 3. It's like a volume knob, just turns the volume down on that noise. And so what it means is when guys have had this, what they describe is that they feel more relaxed. They're not as hypervigilant. They're not as anxious. They're not worrying about things as much as they do. Their family appreciates that they are more easygoing, more present with the family. Their anger is brought way down. So the anger, a lot of guys that are up here with their physiological anxiety are just one little frustration away from an explosion. This brings it down so that those little things don't have that effect. And then maybe best of all is they sleep better. You take all that noise out of the nervous system, and guy's going to sleep better. A gal's going to sleep better. And so what we know is the treatment doesn't necessarily last forever. Sometimes it only lasts for a couple of months. Sometimes it lasts for 6, 12. It can last longer. But once you start sleeping better, once you've had that sensation of, wow, this is what it can feel like to just be really actually relaxed for once, for the first time in 20 years, or maybe forever, that really has a powerful benefit. It opens the door to really starting to be able to better engage in other kinds of healthy activities for life. And if it does wear off, if that arousal returns, you can go and you can have the treatment. You get it again. You can have it repeated more than once or twice. It's not expensive, and it works very effectively for about 90% of the people who receive it.
Wow. That's great. Well, one thing that seems to also be sort of what I hear you saying that is a kind of a recurring theme, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but it sounds to me like there are, and you mentioned at the beginning, almost every system is involved in this syndrome. And so it can't be addressed with just psychotherapy or you got to have somebody, you got to be able to look at all this stuff.
Yes.
How does an individual that doesn't, how do you do that? How do you make that happen?
Yeah. Well, there are a tiny number of slots in the US in specialty programs that will bring an operator in for a month or 3 weeks and do a comprehensive evaluation of all of these systems. There's a limited amount of that. So that's NICO in the DoD, the Intrepid Spirit Centers. On the civilian side, it might be the Marcus Brain Institute. It might be the Home Base program in Boston. And there's others, the Shepherdsman Center in Atlanta. But they can only serve a tiny fraction of the guys out there. And all they really provide is assessments. And maybe they get somebody started on a few treatments, but they're not a long-term provider. So a number of us are trying to, there's an Operator Syndrome Foundation, a new foundation. I'm on their board. We're piloting an approach to treatment. Well, I shouldn't even say we're piloting. We're kind of copying to some extent what Seal Future Foundation has already built, which is to develop a network of specialty providers around the country who can help one by one chip away at these things. So, for example, let's say you live next door to my mother in Columbia, Missouri, and you're an operator. You have a primary care provider there. They can do the hormone panel. They can do the sleep study. So you get the CPAP machine. You start getting treatment for whatever treatment you need for your hormones, and you get the stellate ganglion block. You're immediately going to start with all of those things. You're going to start to feel better. You just are. If I'm your coach, I'm going to talk to you about diet and sleep hygiene, the do's and don'ts. I'm going to talk to you about modifying your workouts so that you're not continuing to put all that repetitive stress and strain on your joints. guess what? I've had a lot of success helping guys switch from free weights and body weight exercises over to using variable resistant band exercises. And I'm talking about the big bands, not bands that have like little hollow tubes. You can go heavy. You can do heavy deadlifts with the right band system. It means you need a bar, you need a plate to stand on. But you can maintain your bulk, you can maintain your muscle mass, but bands work with your strength curve, not against it. So I started doing this myself about 4 years ago, and all my joint pain as an old man, not a tactical athlete, but just my old man joint pain went away. It just dissipated.
Really?
It was amazing. My back pain went away, my elbow, neck, knee, ankle, all of my pain just went away. I was no longer repetitively injuring it every time I worked out. So there's a lot that can be done. You start eating right, get into an anti-inflammatory lifestyle of eating whole foods, cut out the junk food, the sugar, the fast food, minimize the alcohol or eliminate it entirely, eliminate the tobacco. There's a whole lot of gains to be found right there with that. And that's all stuff that's on us. We can all do those things for ourselves. A lot of guys use hot sauna or cold plunges. Those are great for lowering inflammation. They can bring a lot of benefits. But then it's like, where do you find the other treatments? Okay, I've had the stellate ganglion block. My hormones are getting straightened out. Now maybe I want to go see a regenerative medicine clinic. Well, just then do that. Go to one of those clinics, and there are not very many of them that I'm aware of, but there's one in Kansas City, there's one in San Diego, there's a couple in the Panhandle of Florida, et cetera. Take some time and go spend a few days at one of those clinics. Find a foundation that will pay for it, because sometimes that can be found. Another thing that a lot of guys want to do are some of these other specialty treatments like hyperbaric oxygen, transcranial magnetic stimulation, psychedelic journeys. There are foundations, there are programs that do those, that provide those. So I think part of a good care is accepting and recognizing you have to be educated, and you have to be your own quarterback. It's easier to do that if you have a spouse who you trust, and bring the spouse into your care. Have your spouse understand, have your spouse involved in helping move these things along. But also your spouse is going to benefit. A lot of us think that the spouses, they got so much stress on them as well, they're going to benefit from a stellate ganglion block. I know some people who have the opinion that when the operator gets a psychedelic journey, the spouse should also get a psychedelic journey. That they should be doing some of these things, not literally together, but at least in parallel to each other. And we're still learning. Part of my message of hope is we have so many things that can help guys, but we're also learning. So things that I'm recommending now, I didn't even know about 5 years ago, some of them.
Yeah.
And that's the good news. And
well, but so couple of things. Number one, we'll provide a link at the end of this podcast to your operator syndrome paper, a link to your book, which, both of those together provide a pretty good roadmap or a guide for where to go and what to do. And then everything that you just listed, I think maybe we can cut that and see if we can, circulate that, get that out to as many people as possible, because it sounds to me like you provided as much as you can on a general level, just a great roadmap or suggestion for how to make this type of, all these types of treatments happen. Because when you hear about, you got to do, I could imagine somebody being like, where would I even begin to get all that stuff? But you just broke it all down, and in a very, I think, at least as simple as you could make it, to an individual, right? Because my first thought is, if there's one individual, one operator that watches this and can get something from it and can get some relief or some help or some guidance or instructions, then that's phenomenal, right? then there's also sort of in the next issue, which is like from a bigger picture, right? For as a nation, as a country, what do we need to do? What do we need to fix? I think that there's some news that you have to share coming out of Congress recently that's a good step in that direction. But can you help us, those of us that would like to try to do something or raise awareness, what needs to happen here to get us where we need to be?
Right. Well, I think what you're identifying is, as a nation, we have become somewhat oblivious to the reality that we have men and women who are warrior protectors for all of us. And that's our soldiers and our first responders. We don't think about a firefighter until we need one. We don't think about law enforcement until we need one. We almost never think about how the military protects us and keeps us safe. That's just happening in the background, and we just take it for granted. So we do have way too much ignorance in our society, way too much indifference. And I think that's part of what soldiers, veterans, and responders all say is, they all, at some level, they're all very aware of the indifference of society to them, to what they provide. And in many cases, it's not indifference, it's hostility. Defund the police, shame on the soldiers who are doing bad things. There's too much of that. So that's one thing. I wish we could stop saying thank you for your service. Most veterans will tell you that that's more of an insult than anything that they really actually appreciate.
What should people say in replacement if they're genuine? That isn't an insult, or just not say anything at all?
I think in a genuine way, you could say thank you, but then that should be followed up with, and how are you doing? And maybe thank you. What can I do? How can I help? What can I do in return for you, for your brothers and sisters? Right now, but let's talk about policy here a little bit. So from a policy level, I think both our VA and our Department of Defense, and I'll include SOCOM in that, have rather turned a blind eye to our operators and their needs and their special needs. I don't mean special as in they're special, in the sense that they're precious. They're special in the sense that they have unique injuries, they have unique impairments, and that requires unique services. Too often I hear a resistance to providing those services, saying, well, if we do one thing for operators, we got to do it for everybody. It's like, well, sure, provide it to everybody who needs these treatments. And that's going to include all the operators and probably plenty of other people. The VA does not provide stellate ganglion routinely. It does not provide ketamine routinely. It does not routinely screen for hormones.
Why?
That all should change.
Why do they not?
I don't know. I'm not in the VA. I don't know.
Well,
so somebody sent me a short paragraph that was from some that they pulled out of some report that was the VA's reason for not providing stellate ganglion block, and it was they reviewed 2 studies and concluded that it was inconclusive whether the treatment was helpful. I think that was a gross misrepresentation of the actual data and the experience of people who've received the treatment. Good news right now, I think, with the new administration coming in, there's opportunities. But even this past few weeks, the National Defense Authorization has come out, and there's language in there mandating study of hormones in special operators. I think there's a part of that that's about doing more holistic, comprehensive care for operators. So I think that's a great start. That's very promising. I've not seen that before.
That's great.
And I think part of that is going to mean whoever is the next Secretary of Defense in the next administration is one piece of their duty is they're going to have to come to Congress and represent on these matters in the near future. They're going to have to say, here's what we know, here's what we're doing, here's our plans. And I think they're mandating more research be funded. Now I don't know who that next SecDef will be, but a guy named Pete Hegseth has been nominated. I heard him speak on a podcast before I ever even knew who he was a couple months ago, and he was talking about a lot of these things. So I know he's got a lot of the really good right way of, I agreed with a lot of his thoughts, and I also know he has a lot of in his orbit. He's got a lot of special operators who are talking to him. So he's viewed by the operator community, at least the one small group of people I know, as being very legitimate, very concerned individual who has hope of being a champion for their health and functioning.
That's great. That's fantastic. And we can keep our fingers crossed on that. I mentioned to you about a week or so ago that your name came up on the Sean Ryan podcast, the Sean Ryan Show.
That was with Pete Hegseth. That was the episode
Yes.
with Pete Hegseth, right?
And so the subject was, look, the VA, and they were sort of saying, look, everything is sort of messed up at the VA. And Sean Ryan was saying, well, but I think that there's one guy that knows what he's talking about, knows what he's doing with operator syndrome, Dr. Frueh. And they both said yes. Anyway, I jumped on immediately into the comments and said, please interview Dr. Frueh, because, your first point was that there's a lot of ignorance and indifference. And so one thing that seems very easy to me, difficult to actually execute, but easy to sort of understand, is we got to get this word out there that this exists, that these people are suffering, not just amongst the small group that, whether it be inside the VA or, in their own community, but everybody needs to know this. Everyone needs to understand the costs that have been incurred by these people that we've asked so much of. And my gosh, it's not too much to ask. I don't care. It's not too much to ask that everyone, as many people as possible, just at least understand that this is happening. And so hopefully, whether it's the Sean Ryan Show or there's other opportunities for you and others to speak and to tell, a wide swath of the nation, frankly, about this and what's going on. If you had, the opportunity, if you were king for a day, or queen, I'm not king, just want to be politically correct here, right? You were a ruler for a day, and you could move some pieces, you could fix it. Well, that simplifies the issue too much. I don't think there's things that you could do. What would you do as king?
Oh man,
I know I'm putting you on the spot here. That's a tough one.
It's so complicated, but I think awareness and acceptance and understanding would just go a long way. Right now, I think what I see is we have a community that's really injured, really impaired, but the guys in the special operations community are outside the box thinkers. And they've recognized that no one's coming to save them. And that's a phrase I hear a lot. No one's coming to save us. We got to do it ourselves. And to some extent they have, and they are, but they haven't been able to reach all of them, all of their tribe. So if we could get the VA and the DoD and other elements of Western healthcare to tune into this and start paying attention, if we could put the word out there so that more operators and their spouses could be educated on these things, that would just make so much difference. One of the things I often hear, and I'm hearing it a little bit less now because there is an awareness that's growing, but when I talk with somebody and I start, when we have a conversation like we're having now, often guys will just be like, holy cow, how did you know all this stuff about me? I'm like, it's not that I know anything about you. It's that I know what you did and what every other operator who did what you did for so long. I know how it's the same pattern. It's operator syndrome. And when they read the paper, I often get just this response of, holy cow, I had no idea. Now I thought I was the only one. Now I feel good. I feel like I'm back to being part of the tribe. I feel like I'm not weak. I'm not different. I'm like everybody else. We're all struggling, and there's a word for it, and there's ideas and a framework to understand it. And that's what operator syndrome is, by the way. It's a framework for understanding these injuries and these impairments. We can also use that here's another piece. We can use this framework early and throughout a career in law enforcement, in firefighting, in the military, to help mitigate and manage these injuries along the way. We don't have to wait till somebody is ready to take off their uniform to say, okay, now we'll finally try to take care of you. There's a lot we can do along the way.
That's fantastic. And so we will also provide a link. Well, we can talk after this, and you can give us some thoughts on what are the best links that we need to provide at the end of the show to direct people to your site, to your paper, to the book, and then to maybe we can get 10 or 12 different foundations, that some of the ones that you mentioned, like the SEAL Future Foundation, and then potentially some info on the stellate ganglion block and things like that. Because my hope is, this is a passion of mine that I've always been interested in a lot of this stuff, but I didn't know, frankly, until you and I were connected the first time. But I'm passionate about figuring out how we can help this community, and I want to try to do my part in spreading the word. And I'm going to be pushy and annoying and send this and our prior podcast to a bunch of people who don't know me that say they need to watch this.
Thank you for that.
And well, thank you, because I wouldn't know about it. I don't know if the world would know about it or would have what you've done is you've given it a name, you've drawn a circle around it and identified the framework so that we can all start to we all are talking from the same sheet of music. We all are addressing, the thing until you put a name to it and understand. When I say put a name to, I mean, until you put a name to the framework of it, it's hard to really even, have anything to talk about. So you have just single-handedly changed a lot of lives and a lot of people.
I haven't done anything single-handedly. No, sir. I can't accept
well,
that.
you and your colleagues, you and your colleagues and everybody, but I just know that it's appreciated by a lot of folks. I can't believe how long we've gone. I apologize for that, but
this has been a great talk. No apologies.
Is there anything that we didn't speak about that you were hoping that we could get in there or discuss?
Well, there's just so much. There's so many angles and layers, but I guess I always just like to end with a message of hope. Don't take your life. We've had so many suicides in the responder and an operator and veteran community. Hardly a week goes by when some friend or contact of mine doesn't send me a message about a suicide in the community. So it's heartbreaking. I want to end on a message of hope. There's so much we can do. I know so many guys that have gone from having, the Glock in their hand, in their mouth, to living their best life now, thriving, happy, good marriages, good jobs, part of their community. And so it can be found, can be reached. You just gotta push for it, and you gotta be smart, and you gotta be persistent in the face of the inevitable obstacles that are there.
I love that. And there are people that care, and there are people that are working on this, and there are people that want to help.
100%. Yeah.
Well, Dr. Frueh, thank you so much. This is just, it's always such a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you, Brandon. Really enjoyed our conversations.
Likewise.
Don't forget, everybody, you can find Boundary Breakers in a lot of places. You can watch our episodes on the Boundary Breakers YouTube channel, or you can listen to each podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or any of the other major podcasting platforms. Thanks for listening.